The wind screamed against the duplex windows as if it wanted in. Naomi Carter woke before the last echo of the pounding on her door had faded. Her heart ran faster than her breath. She reached for the heavy flashlight on the nightstand, the one with a dent in its barrel from years of fixing what no one else would fix. 3 more blows rattled the door. Then silence, thick and wrong. The air inside the duplex was sharp with the smell of cold metal and dust from the radiator. She crossed the small living room barefoot, feet whispering across the worn rug, and stood before the door. One hand gripped the flashlight. The other hovered near the deadbolt. "Who is it?" she called. Nothing. Then a man's voice, hoarse, shaking as though the words had to climb over fear. "Please. Rosalyn. She'll know what to do." Naomi froze. Rosalyn. She didn't know any Rosalyn. Outside the door came the weak scrape of boots on frozen steps, a sound so desperate it was human beyond doubt. Naomi turned the deadbolt. Cold air and snow burst through as she opened the door. A tall man collapsed forward into her arms, soaked through, heavy with exhaustion. His coat was a frozen crust. His breath smelled of metal and lake water. For a moment she thought he was dead. Then his chest hitched, shallow and rapid. From down the hallway a small, sleepy voice said, "Is he Santa?" Naomi glanced back. Zoe stood in the doorway of her room, clutching her rabbit by one ear, curls shadowing her round face. Naomi said, "He's someone who needs help. Bring the big blanket." Zoe nodded and disappeared. Naomi dragged the man to the couch. His weight was enormous, his coat leaking water onto the rug. The radiator hissed behind them like a snake, learning to breathe. The man's eyes fluttered open. They were pale gray, almost silver. He tried to speak, failed, then whispered, "Don't let them take me back." The kettle on the stove began to whine, a clean, domestic sound slicing through the chaos. Naomi caught it and shut the flame off. She poured water into 2 chipped mugs, the last of her old tea bags steeping in a swirl of color that smelled faintly of comfort. She carried a mug to him. "Drink slow," she said. He stared at the cup as though uncertain it was real. She helped him lift it. Steam blurred his face. She asked. He blinked, struggling to locate the answer. "Lawrence." His voice cracked. "Lawrence Witford." Naomi froze again. The name was familiar, something she had heard on the television in passing, attached to buildings she could never afford to enter. Before she could form a question, Zoe returned, with the quilt dragging across the floor. Naomi wrapped it around him. His shoulders shook as warmth began to sink in. The television, left on low for background noise, shifted to the late news. The anchor's even voice drifted through the room. Prominent businessman Lawrence Witford has been reported missing. His car was found near Canal Park. Authorities believe Naomi lunged for the remote and killed the screen, but the image remained in her mind, the younger version of the man before her. Hair neat, tie perfect, a man who owned light instead of hiding from it. He saw the blank screen, recognized what had been there, and whispered. They found the car. Naomi's skin prickled. "You need to tell me who's after you." He shook his head, eyes darting toward the window. "You wouldn't believe me. Try me." He swallowed. "My son and the council, they make people disappear. They put pills in the vitamins. Forget the files. Forget the names. Forget who I signed for." Naomi stared. The words were a tangle, but beneath the madness there was order. He wasn't raving. He was remembering. "Who is Rosalyn?" she asked. He closed his eyes. "She built the trust. Lake Superior Children's Trust. The only honest part left. She hid the backups. She told me, if I ever forget, find her. She'd know how to make it right." The name struck something deep in Naomi, a strange chord between guilt and duty. Children's Trust. She thought of Zoe, her boots too small for another winter, the overdue bill on the counter marked in red. She had spent months fighting to keep their world warm. Now a stranger, with the same exhaustion, sat on her couch, asking her to risk what little she had. She did a quick inventory, the survival habit of anyone living too close to the edge. 2 cans of soup, 1 flashlight, the wrench by the sink, a phone at 40%. The back door's deadbolt stiff but working. Every resource counted. Every mistake could cost. Zoe climbed onto the arm of the couch and studied the man's face with the serious curiosity only a child could have. "Scary?" she asked quietly. Naomi forced a smile. "Just late. And cold. We're okay." Her fingers tightened around the flashlight handle until her knuckles whitened. She was lying for her daughter's sake, and Zoe's eyes seemed to know it. The man shivered again. Naomi fetched a bowl, poured soup, set it before him. Steam clouded the air with the faint smell of salt and chicken. She said. He obeyed, clumsy but grateful. When the spoon clattered against the bowl, she noticed how steady his hands had become. "Why here?" she asked. "Why my door?" He stared at the flickering radiator light. "I walked. The lake pushed me inland. I remembered a name from somewhere. Naomi Carter. I think Rosalyn said it once." Naomi's throat tightened. "She knew me. Maybe. Maybe she just knew what kind of person you are." He coughed. "Good people fix things. You fix things, don't you?" The question landed too close. She thought of the tools on the kitchen counter, the invoices for repairs she did after hours because she couldn't watch something broken stay that way. "What's in the files?" she asked. He shook his head again. "Land deals, zoning, shell companies under children's funds. They called it growth. Rosalyn called it theft." The radiator banged, a hollow metallic snap that made all 3 of them flinch. Then silence again. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls. Naomi rose and checked the window locks. Habit turned into ritual. She rubbed a circle of fog from the glass and looked out. The street lay empty but for the swirling snow. The light from the corner lamp painted everything in shades of tin. For an instant she thought she saw a shape beyond the curb, a vehicle idling with its lights off. Then a gust swept the view clean. She turned back. Lawrence's eyes followed her every movement. "They'll come," he said softly. "When the snow stops, they'll come." "How do you know?" "They always finish what they start." Naomi went to the counter, picked up her phone, and glanced at the screen. No messages. No calls. The battery symbol glowed faintly red. "Do you have a phone?" he asked. She nodded. "Turn it off," he said. They listened for the hum between rings. Something in his tone left no room for argument. Naomi pressed the power button. The apartment fell a fraction quieter, as if the air itself had been holding its breath. "Happy now," she said. He exhaled, eyes closing. "Suffer." Naomi stood over him, arms crossed, watching the rise and fall of his chest. The color was coming back to his cheeks, but fear still lived behind the half-open lids. "Lawrence," she said, her voice softer now, "if what you're saying is true, why come here alone? Why not go to the police?" His lips twitched in something that might have been a smile. "They are the council." The answer chilled her more than the draft from the door. She sat down across from him, the flashlight still in her hand, though she no longer remembered lifting it. "You said Rosalyn hid backups. Where?" He shook his head weakly. "She didn't tell me. She said it had to stay secret until the right hands found it." Naomi leaned back, trying to slow the turn of her thoughts. She had heard stories like this before. Whistleblowers, conspiracies, but something about the texture of his fear felt real. Zoe yawned and leaned into her mother's side. Naomi draped an arm around her. "Time to sleep," she murmured. But he's still scared, Zoe said. Naomi smoothed her daughter's hair. Then we'll keep watch. Both of us. Zoe nodded and closed her eyes against Naomi's shoulder. For a long while no one spoke. The wind dulled to a low moan. Lawrence's breathing evened out. Naomi watched the faint shadow under the door, the ghost of streetlight shifting with every passing gust. She thought again of the idling shape by the curb, the kind of car that didn't belong in this neighborhood. Her own reflection ghosted in the window. Woman, child, stranger, wrapped in borrowed warmth. Everything about it looked temporary, as though one more wrong noise would erase the scene entirely. She reached over and pulled the quilt higher around the man's shoulders. His eyes opened, dull with exhaustion, but still tracking her. "If they come," he whispered, "say you never saw me." "Sleep," she said. "Promise me." Naomi met his gaze and saw the plea for what it was. Not selfish, but the raw instinct of someone who had seen power without mercy. "I promise," she said, though she knew promises could become weapons. He nodded once and let his eyes close. Naomi sat still, listening to the radiator sigh, to Zoe's quiet breaths, to the far hum of the city, turning in its sleep. Beneath those sounds she imagined another rhythm, the steady pulse of something moving closer through the snow. The duplex held its breath with her, caught between warmth and cold, between safety and the world outside. And in that waiting silence, Naomi understood that opening the door had already changed everything. Naomi did not lie down. The room had the hush of a held breath, a hush that pretended to be safety, because the radiator hummed and the kettle could be made to sing on command. She knew better than to trust a hush. Lawrence lay beneath her quilt and the old throw, the two layers trapping heat that felt honest and treacherous at once. Warmth could lull a person into thinking the night would be kind. Warmth could soften the sightlines until danger wore a friendly face. She would not be softened. She moved through the tiny kitchen by touch, keeping one palm on the counter as if it were a rail along a narrow stair. The smell of metal and dust clung to the air like a thin, cold film. On the counter lay the small stack that never left her. Envelopes with red bars, a flyer about winter clothing, a folded receipt with grainy ink. She slid the drawer open and lifted her jacket. In the inner pocket, the boot money waited. $340. Not numbers on a ledger, but a promise she had spoken to herself for weeks. Boots for Zoe, dry socks, a walk to school without wet toes, and the cough that always followed. Naomi pressed the bills deeper, and in doing so felt something like a lever inside her chest. She was staking that promise now, not to a stranger exactly, but to the weight of a truth he had carried through the storm. The calculation was painful and clear. She was mortgaging winter to pay forward a chance at daylight. Behind her, the kettle began to whisper, then pushed up into its bright whistle. She let it run 2 seconds longer than necessary, then lifted it and cut the flame. The clean, decisive sound sliced the room into before and after. Control was not loud. It was measured. She poured a little hot water over the last of her tea, 2 tired sachets. She would stretch again later. She took a sip she did not need. The heat reminded her body it could be steady because she had chosen to be. On the couch, Lawrence pushed a hand free of the quilt and rubbed his temple as if a word were stuck there. His eyes had climbed partway out of the fog. They were the gray of the lake at first light, a color that held both steel and mercy. He watched the steam lift from her cup with a child's concentration, then shifted his gaze to the window. "They will tell you I am confused," he said, voice raw from cold and fear. "And whatever had been slipped into his life, they will show you how my hands shake. They will call it sad. The thing about sad is it makes people gentle when they should be exact. Then be exact, she said, and the steadiness in her tone surprised her. He nodded once, very slightly, as if the gesture itself cost. I know there are bank accounts we never had permission to open. I know land that belonged to everyone became land that profited a very few, and the papers smiled while they did it. I know my signature does not loop its W that way. The forgery loops wide and careless, like arrogance pretending to be speed. I know Rosalyn collected proof. She hid what heat could not easily find. Faulty wiring, Naomi said. She let the two words sit there without question marks. The official story loves a tidy phrase. She had rewired enough rooms to recognize how often neglect dressed itself as an accident. He shut his eyes. She called me the night before. She said she had enough to make lies turn to ash. The fire came first. Zoe sighed in her sleep and rolled, her small hand searching for Naomi, out of habit. Naomi was already there. She threaded her fingers through the child's curls and felt the pulse at the soft place on the side of her neck. Safe for now. Safety as momentary fact, not as assumption. The difference was a discipline. Naomi crossed to the window and wiped a crescent of fog with her sleeve. Snow canted across the street lamp's cone, a slow, white static. Beyond the drifted curb, she saw a shape that did not belong to snow. A car sat with its lights off and patience on. She did not stare. Some attention is an invitation. She let the curtain fall, turned, and walked back to the counter. The folded receipt lay there. Grainy ink, listing salt and screws and bread. She picked up a pen and wrote the first three numbers she had caught in the instant her eyes had touched the plate. It was a small act, almost nothing, yet it sent a fierce heat through her. When no one gives you a system, you make one. You make receipts where there are none. You create proof before someone tells you your memory is a rumor. She slid the receipt under a magnet on the fridge, then changed her mind, and tucked it into the little notebook she kept in her pocket with the stub of a pencil. Paper on a door can be bumped loose. Paper against a body has a better chance of surviving what a night decides to do. You turned off your phone, Lawrence said. It was not a question. You told me to, she said. Thank you, he said. They listened for the hum between rings. The phrase landed with the weight of something learned the hard way. Naomi felt a sharp, bright satisfaction at the small cliff her choice had already created. Isolation could be terror. It could also be a moat. She set a small plastic bin on the table and opened it. Inside lay the tools of a person who solved problems that did not wait for business hours. The screwdriver with the flathead, worn thin where it had opened things that were not built to be opened. The multi-tool with a nick in its blade that fit an old utility lock like a key made by a friend. Clear tape. Zip bags folded into tight squares. A black marker that could sign a name or label truth. She set each item in a deliberate line. The quiet choreography of someone lacing a boot before a climb. This was not violence. This was readiness. This was the opposite of hoping. The radiator clicked in its throat, then settled. Warmth poured into the room like a patient lie. Naomi refused it. She turned back to the couch and knelt so her eyes were level with Lawrence's. You said Rosalyn hid proof where heat could not easily get at it, she said. Think about her hands. Where would she reach without looking? He focused on a spot beyond her shoulder, as if the memory lived there. She liked places that did not impress anyone, he said. The diner where the waitresses forgot who had money. The office where she left drawers open on purpose, because open things do not look like secrets. The warehouse by the railroad, because it was only walls and air and dust and the past. She called it her fortress. She said if anyone came looking, she would leave enough there to burn the lies to ash. The word fortress entered Naomi's body like a second spine. She could almost see the place now. the boarded windows, and the honest cold, and the way light would carve the dust into ribbons. Her mouth lifted at one corner, not a smile, but the cousin of one. The warehouse, she said, walls that only know how to be walls. He let out a breath, almost relief. You believe me. I believe you believe what you have told me, she said. That is enough for us to move. She stood and went to the closet. The jacket she took down was the one with the deep inner pocket. She slid the boot money into it and pressed the zipper closed. The sound of the teeth engaging felt like a small seal placed on a larger vow. She would not pretend she had not felt the loss as soon as she decided to spend it on peril instead of rubber soles. She carried that ache the way she carried the flashlight, firm and useful. She laid her father's flannel on the arm of the couch and helped Lawrence sit up to pull it on. The old shirt had survived jobs and years and grief. It would survive this. She found a cap and stretched it until it would sit on his head. She pushed a pair of her spare gloves into his hands and did not wait for the refusal she saw starting there. Warmth had its place, not as a trance, but as armor. Zoe stirred and lifted her head. "Are we going?" she said, voice blurred by sleep and interest. "Mission," Naomi said. "Detective work." Zoe smiled into her sleeve. "Detective Zoe is ready." Naomi knelt so they were eye to eye. "Rules," she said, and spoke them as if they came printed on the inside of the night. "We do not talk unless I ask you a question. We hold hands, or we hold coats. We listen with our whole bodies. If I say down, we go down. If I say still, we are stone." Zoe repeated the words like a charm, each one clicking into place. Lawrence watched the exchange with an expression Naomi could not read, part gratitude and part grief, as if something about the scene reminded him of a life that had become a photograph he could no longer hold. Before the door, Naomi paused. She looked once more at the line of tools on the table, at the tidy zip bags, and the permanent marker, and the screwdriver with its thin, honest edge. She slid the tool roll into the duffel beside spare socks, a first aid kit, heavy on tape, 2 spoons, the second-to-last tea bag, because comfort could be rationed later like proof. She added the little notebook and the stub of pencil. When a story wants to erase you, write harder. She let her palm rest on the door. The wood was cold and slightly damp, like an animal that had come in from the dark and was trying to pretend it lived here. Her throat tightened, not with fear, but with a sudden, fierce clarity. She could let the night soothe her into stillness, with its radiator hum, and the quilt's weight, and the idea of morning, or she could move now while the storm made it harder for some kinds of power to see. She looked back at the couch. Lawrence's breath had steadied, but the fear lived under his eyes like the shadow of a bruise. He met her gaze. "Thank you," he said, the words almost soundless. "Do not thank me yet," she said. "Save it for a day when it costs less." She opened the door. Cold air rose to meet them, quick and clean, cutting through the apartment's tired warmth. The hallway smelled like wet wool and old paint. Naomi turned the lock behind them and pocketed the key. Ritual is not superstition. Ritual is a list you write for your hands, so your mind can plan the next 3 moves. They took the stairs slow. The building groaned in the way old buildings groan, a kind of private speech Naomi had learned to hear without alarm. Outside, the drift had pressed its white body up against the stoop. The street lamp burned in its tin halo. The black shape beyond the curb had not moved. Naomi did not look at it a second time. Some truths are felt in the skin before they are proved on paper. She got Zoe into the truck and fastened the belt, then eased Lawrence into the passenger seat and wrapped the quilt around his legs, as if they were old friends who had been traveling together for years. She slid behind the wheel and kept the headlights low. The engine resisted, then recognized her voice, and came up. She let the tires find purchase where packed snow pretends to be pavement. Where? Lawrence asked. Voice, a scraped whisper. Railroad Avenue, Naomi said. The warehouse. The walls that only know how to be walls. From the back seat, Zoe said she was ready. Naomi felt the answer in her hands before she spoke it. Me too, she said, and the words were a lock turning. Clean and final, the truck rolled out into the wind, and behind them, the apartment exhaled the last of its false peace. Ahead, the city lay drawn in cold lines that could be read by anyone willing to keep going. The boot money rode in Naomi's pocket like a small heartbeat. It was not lost yet. It had simply been moved into a new kind of promise, one that would buy more than leather and rubber if she did the next thing right. Railroad Avenue crouched against the lake, wind like a stray dog guarding old bones. Naomi eased the truck into the shadow of the loading dock and killed the engine. Silence gathered, big and brittle. The warehouse slouched before them, a long brick body with its windows boarded and its roof lines sagging under the weight of winters that had done their slow work. The air tasted of iron and wet dust. Snow moved in a slow ash across the street, brushing the walls as if trying to erase them. Zoe breathed a sleepy hum in the back seat, the sound small and human inside the frozen hush. Lawrence stared through the windshield, with the fixed attention of someone navigating by memory more than sight. The old flannel hung loose on him, the quilt pooled in his lap like a shoreline that would not hold. She called this place her fortress, he said, voice roughened by cold and whatever had been slipped into his life. If anyone came looking, there would be enough here to burn lies to ash. Naomi nodded once. She touched each tool by habit, the way a climber taps each knot before trusting a wall. Multi-tool, zip bags folded into clean squares, black marker, notebook with a pencil the size of a thumb, the screwdriver with the flathead worn thin where it had opened things that were not built to be opened. She tucked the driver into her coat pocket until the metal found its familiar groove, the bills in the inner pocket pressed against her ribs. The boot money, the winter promise. She felt them and accepted the ache. Some promises have to travel to become useful. Rules are the same. Detective, she said over her shoulder. Zoe pushed Pepper into her coat and nodded, eyes wide and bright, every part of her ready to listen with her whole body. Naomi stepped out into the cold. The dock boards flexed under her weight and spoke their old language. When her palm found the warehouse side door, the wood was so cold it felt wet. A chain looped through a new brass lock, the only shiny thing in sight. She crouched, the multi-tool's bite familiar in her hand. The steel resisted, then slipped, then caught. The lock sulked, and then surrendered with a small click. She eased the chain to the planks. The door moved inward, a stingy inch, then another. The hinges answered with a long, complaining scream that crawled the brick and came back at them. Naomi stilled, breath held. The sound bled away into the warehouse body, then fell quiet. She widened the gap and slid them through, one by one, guiding Zoe with a hand at her shoulder and steadying Lawrence with a pressure at his elbow. Inside, the air was its own weather, damp and cold, the smell of paper that had learned to rot, and the clean bitterness of rust. Naomi thumbed the flashlight on and kept the beam low. Their footsteps echoed, a hollow double beat that made the space feel larger and more exposed. The beam cut a taper through the dust. Motes spun like slow confetti in a parade for no one. Cabinets lined the far wall with their drawers, yawning like broken teeth. A shelf lay on its face. Ribs snapped. Its shadow, a crooked ladder, across the floor. Old pallets stacked in a lopsided tower hid a low door in the far left. The concrete bore scuffs and wheel scars, the thin signatures of work that had once mattered. "Stay close," Naomi said. "If I say stone, we turn to stone." Zoe pressed against her leg and became smaller without losing balance. Lawrence moved with clumsy stubbornness. The quilt caught under his hand. Like a flag he refused to drop. At the first cabinet, Naomi felt the relief of action push back the edge of fear. She slid drawers and found forms blurred to gray by damp. Donation lists, grant approvals, receipts for diapers and shelf milk, the paper bones of real help. The next cabinet had less mercy. Hollow drawers. The sound of metal stuttering on its runners said someone had pulled and pulled again until they decided emptiness could pass, for proof of nothing to see. "Someone ransacked this," Naomi said softly. "They tore the surface, so we would stop before we reached the floor." Lawrence answered, voice, even in that dangerous way that rests on certainty. She lifted the flashlight and let the beam draw a new line across the wall. That was when she saw it. Avent, high and left, 4 screws holding its tired frame, and each screw showing the faint silver crescent of a driver that had bitten and let go. Paint shaved thin around the heads. The vent set slightly crooked, not by accident, but by care, doing its best to erase its own traces. Vents, Naomi thought, open drawers, places that do not flatter the eye. She dragged the fallen shelf to the wall, braced its end with her boot, stepped up, and steadied herself with a palm against brick. Zoe's hands flew to the shelf's far leg, a small body holding the steadiness that steadiness requires. Naomi lifted the screwdriver and set its edge into the first screw. It turned with a dry little moan and came loose. The second spun too easily, a sign of previous hands. The third resisted. The driver slipped, metal skating across metal, with a chirp that sounded louder than it was. Zoe's head snapped up. Naomi froze and met her daughter's eyes. The two of them held the silence by its edges until it learned its place again. Naomi set the point, slowed her wrist, and turned. The screw gave. The fourth followed. She eased the vent away and let it hang from her fingers until she could lower it without squeal. Cold air slid out of the dark throat behind the grill. Naomi angled the light inside. Torn insulation, a dull shape farther back, plastic wrap, gone cloudy. The lip of a metal box. She reached in past the scratchy batting until the cold bit her wrist bone and closed her hand around the handle. The box was heavier than it looked. She pulled it out, set it on the shelf, and let the weight settle into the wood before climbing down. On the floor, she laid the lockbox at her knees. The dial wore a soft polish, where fingers had turned it often in long-gone years. The latch was unremarkable and honest. No label, no flourish. She told me that if I forgot everything, I would still remember one number, Lawrence said. 3, 7, 8. Naomi turned the dial with the patience she used when a panel would not let a breaker push back to life. The world narrowed to the soft rasp of metal on metal, and the moment the mechanism recognized the right pattern, a small click, exact and satisfying, returned to her hand. She lifted the lid. A neat stack of manila envelopes lay within, banded by a rubber strip turned brittle with time. A handful of printed photographs, their edges clean, and a small black drive labeled in tidy block letters that made her chest tighten in recognition. Backup RK. The initials had the gravity of someone who expected to be argued with and chose order as her answer. Naomi did not touch everything at once. She took a zip bag and opened it so carefully the plastic hardly whispered. The drive slid inside. She pressed the seal until it closed with a smooth, certain line. She reached for the marker and wrote, clean and slow, her initials, the date, the place. the hour from her watch. Railroad Avenue Warehouse. She said the words under her breath, as if speaking them put a ring around the moment that would keep it from blurring. Chain of custody is not poetry, she thought, but when it is done right, it becomes a kind of spell. What is it? Zoe whispered. Eyes big as coins. A way to make truth stay true. Naomi said, we say what we took, where we took it, and when. Then anyone who wants to change the story has to defeat time. Zoe nodded with solemn delight, as if learning a secret rule of a game she had always wanted to play. Naomi slid one envelope free and lifted its flap. Photographs lay inside, cool and slightly curled. She raised the flashlight to a shallow angle so the glare would not wipe the faces. In one picture, Evan Witford shook hands with a developer Naomi had seen on the evening news beside Steel and Glass. Another showed Evan slipping an envelope to a councilman outside a restaurant whose frost tracked the pavement like veins. Another caught a meeting at a lakefront fence, the light bent low by dusk. In the bottom corner of each print, a small stamped line gave a date, an hour, a place, the way a person might say, I was there. Lawrence made a sound like a breath that forgot how to become a word. She fed the camera, he said quietly. She did not trust memory to fight alone. She knew what they would call us. She made the paper speak for itself. Naomi opened the next envelope. Bank statements. Transfers between accounts with names so bland they rang false. The numbers behaved as numbers do, but the pattern behind them did not. She held a page to the light and found the signature where approval lived. Lawrence Witford. She looked at the loop that tried to be a W, wide and careless, as if speed were a costume for power. She reached into the box and slid a different photograph free. An old ribbon cutting, a younger Lawrence smiling without strain. His name sat under that picture too. The W looped twice. Neat and tight, the product of a hand that had practiced itself across years. Your W loops twice, Naomi said, keeping her voice level. This one loops once and sprawls. The arrogance of a forgery is that it believes no one is looking. He bowed his head and then lifted it, eyes bright with exhaustion and rage that had been forced into good manners. That is not mine, he said. Nor that. Nor that. He pointed as she turned pages. The pattern held. The pattern accused. Naomi slid the statements into a second zip bag. She pressed the seal. She wrote place and hour and the initials that would pin the moment. She did the same for the photographs. The marker stroked straight and spare. Her hands worked with the clean economy of someone who had been under pressure before and had learned that precision turns panic into order. The building changed its tone. It was small at first, the way air moves a wall when the pressure outside shifts. Naomi felt it in her ribs before she heard it with her ears. Then the sound came. An engine hum, low and patient, drew close and settled. Headlights brushed the boarded seams and cut a thin white line along the floor under the main door. The cold in the room sharpened, as if attention itself had lowered the temperature. Zoe looked up. Naomi did not have to say stone. The child leaned into her leg and went still in that absolute way only children and animals can manage. Pepper's ear poked from her coat like a flag, refusing to fall. Voices came through the wood after a pause. Not loud, not trying to scare anybody. Confident speech travels quietly. We ripped this place last week, said the first voice, close to the door. There is nothing left. Then we missed something, said the other, older and steadier. The old man is gone. The woman who helped him has something we missed. Lawrence's hands crushed the quilt edge. He did not make a sound. Naomi could feel his fear like another weather in the room, and she did not let it decide what happened next. She lowered the lid of the lockbox without letting it latch. She slipped the band that had held the envelopes around her wrist, a small bite of rubber that promised she would keep holding what needed holding. She put the bagged drive into the duffel side pocket by itself, separate, because separation can be a kind of safety. The photographs and statements went into the main pouch in their own stack, labeled, counted. She shouldered the weight and let it become part of her. Light from outside sliced the crack at the door again and steadied, like a thought that had stopped pacing and chosen an idea. Naomi let her own beam fall to the floor and traced the path to the low door behind the pallets. A way out is a kind of proof too. She pointed once and moved. Zoe matched her without a sound. Lawrence stood, his breath stumbling and then catching itself, and followed with that dogged dignity a hurting body can find when it must. The low door stuck at first. Paint, holding paint with a tired grip. Naomi leaned her shoulder and exhaled. The frame sighed and let go. Cold rose from the dark throat below. Steps waited, narrow and mean. Naomi set her foot, then another, and let the stair answer to wait. Above them, a hinge swallowed its complaint. The main door opened enough to let a different air in. Headlights washed the floor in a pale blade. Naomi took the next step, and the next, and the next. The truth sat warm against her side in plastic and ink, small and exact. The pursuit began the way all pursuits begin, not with a shout, but with the feeling that someone else had decided to occupy the same air. She looked once at Zoe, felt the child's hand close around the rail, and let the warehouse and the men and the old cold lift away behind them as they went down into a colder dark that, for the moment, belonged more to them than to anyone outside. The stairwell turned tight, pressing Naomi's shoulder against cold concrete, while the duffel scraped in a whisper she refused to let grow into sound. The air tasted of iron and old dust, the kind that remembers many winters and forgives none. She kept the flashlight cupped and low, showing only the next step and the slice of wall that would not betray them with shine. Zoe's gloved hand moved along the rail, small and sure. Above, hinges swallowed their complaint, and then came the soft hush of men entering a room as if it already belonged to them. At the bottom waited a cramped landing and a pane of basement glass furred with frost. Naomi set the beam on the sill, angled away, and placed her palm to the window. It bit like a clean blade. She braced the flathead at the puttied corner and turned her wrist. Old compound cracked with a dry sigh. A second turn. The corner freed. Snow breathed through in a powder hush. She cleared the jag of glass with careful taps, then pulled the quilt up the wall so it would not sing when the edge met cloth. She lifted Zoe and fed her through. The child wriggled. Boots, finding drift. Then a mitten reappeared. Reaching back, Naomi squeezed it once. The duffel came next. She shouldered through the gap and took the cold full in the face. It woke every nerve in a clean line. She turned, planted, and drew Lawrence after her. He slid on one knee, breath-catching, and then stood with that stubborn dignity of a body that refuses to be told what it cannot do. Behind the wall, the warehouse took a new breath, the thin echo of boots across concrete, the low murmur of men who preferred not to shout. Naomi stuffed the quilt tight in the window mouth to blur the arrow their bodies might have drawn. Snow began to erase their prints the instant they set them. The lot lay flat and white between warehouse and loading dock, and beyond that, the truck hunched where she had left it, windows filmed with frost like a cataract waiting for a hand. She said, not with speed but with intent, the way a word can move along the ground and not climb into the air. Zoe tucked close, mirroring Naomi's cadence, steps that chose balance first. Lawrence followed with a hand to his ribs and a jaw set against the knight's opinion. They reached the truck, and the key met the ignition. The engine objected, reconsidered, and came up to a working growl. Naomi kept the headlights low. The wheel felt right in her gloves, where years had burnished a roughness into a familiar map. She rolled them off slow because slow reads as calm, and calm buys seconds. The dock fell away. The corner of brick, the nervous rectangle of warehouse door. A thin blade of light slid under the seam behind them and stayed there, as if the building had cut itself open to think. Naomi let the tires find the center where plow had failed, and fresh snow lay proud. Old snow lies, she told herself in the voice she used for wiring runs and balky breakers. Fresh snow grips. She took the right tires to the shelf of unbroken powder. The truck settled and held. She felt the small satisfaction of physics, obeyed. Behind, a shape peeled from shadow and tucked in, without headlights. Sure as a habit, she lifted her foot a fraction. The old desk trick from late shifts. An invitation for an impatient tail to show itself. The shape stayed patient. She felt animal alertness climb the back of her neck and set its teeth. Rules, she said, still watching the street. Stone when you say, Zoe said from the back. Hands or coats. Listen with my whole body. The block ended at an intersection where the wind had drawn drifts into ribs and the lamps threw soft cones, the color of old tin. Naomi signaled right and went straight, letting the truck fishtail and then catch itself like a dancer pretending a stumble. In the mirror, the shadow hesitated, corrected, and kept the distance polite. She pressed the truck into the scuffed grooves, then stepped it out again to new snow. Fresh grips, old lies. They crossed a lip of ice where a plow had stuttered and left a frozen tongue. The duffel bumped the seat back. Lawrence flinched, a hand to his chest, then forced breath to remember its job. Naomi took them past a parked car, wearing a crown of powder and a Union sticker on its bumper, a stubborn human detail that made the map feel local and real. She filed it. Details stack when you let them. The shadow drifted closer, as if familiarity were a kindness. For the length of a block, headlights flared and then went dark again. A neat suggestion that this was care and not threat. Naomi's jaw set. Not cops. Cops like being seen. She turned onto a straight that ran between storage garages and the river. Here, the plow had lost interest. The road was two bruised grooves separated by slick. Naomi took one glance at the shoulders and put the right tires into the untracked edge again. Fresh grips, she told the wheel. Old snow lies. The truck bit and floated forward. Steady. In the mirror, the shadow tried the grooves first. Fishtailed wide. Corrected. And dropped a car length. Naomi let herself think the sentence she had been earning. Make them pay with time. The words sat warm in her mouth like strong tea. Time is money to men who rent patience and bill it by the hour. Let them burn it. Detective Zoe is counting cars. Came a whisper from the back. The quiet kind. Good count, Naomi said, and could not keep the corner of her mouth from moving. They slid behind a sleeping plow for half a block, borrowing its bulk as curtain. The shadow had to choose a lane to keep sightlines, and in choosing, gave Naomi one more breath. An alley mouth produced a careful sedan. Naomi tapped the horn twice. Polite punctuation, and the careful driver froze. She slid past. The shadow stopped too. Another breath won and banked. The city widened as it sloped toward the river. Houses leaned back into yards freshly erased by snow. A swing set held a sugar crust. Maple Avenue crossed ahead beneath old oaks that always held more winter than any other tree. Naomi turned onto it and let the truck idle behind a broken hedge, 2 doors from a porch, with a door painted red that had faded toward brick, under many seasons and many hands. A great oak stood in the yard like a watchman who had not slept in years. "We are in and out," Naomi said. "No silhouette, no talking unless I ask. If I say stone, you become weight." Zoe nodded and tucked Pepper deeper into her coat, as if the rabbit understood new rules. Lawrence's breath came shallow, eyes fixed on the house as if recognition lived there and could crawl out and greet him. The shape that had followed them oozed down the far end of the block and settled with a patience that read as insult. 3 houses away, engine low, lights off, confidence on. Naomi watched the street through the mirror. No curtain stirred, no dog sat up to disapprove. "Quiet can be a set. We do not give them the door," she said. "We take the side. Lights off, no shapes against glass." She killed the engine. The last breath from the heater ran across their faces and was gone. Cold climbed her wrists. She opened her door a narrow inch and waited to learn what that changed. Nothing moved. She slid out and let the hedge take her outline apart. The duffel strap cut into her collarbone in a way she welcomed. Weight keeps a person honest. She lifted Zoe to the ground on the lee side and pointed to the hedges. The child flowed the way a child flows, when taught to listen with a whole body. Naomi helped Lawrence down, steadying him when his knee argued. They crossed to the side yard in a low, patient crouch, the rhythm of people who know they are interesting to someone they cannot see. Up close, the porch wood smelled of old cedar, dry and clean, the same scent that had lived in the lockbox plastic, as if Rosalyn had chosen cedar as a quiet signature. Naomi felt a click of recognition between places, a line drawn by a methodical mind across time. She found the basement window seam where dried putty had pulled back from stone. The flathead eased and worried until the line gave up small curls. The winter plastic peeled with a sound like paper surrendering. The pane lifted and breathed cold. They slipped inside, one by one, into a square of concrete, a washer, a water heater humming a polite constant, and stairs climbing toward a door sketched in weak streetlight. The whole house above them felt like a lung that had been holding its breath for years. "Is this her house?" Zoe whispered, as if trying on a password. "It was," Naomi said. "It can be again." Lawrence set his palm to the center support post and closed his eyes. He listened to the frequency of the place. The language old houses speak in pops and weight and air movement. His nod was small and private, like permission passed between friends. Outside, tires rolled soft. A car door whispered open. Another, voices low enough to be called careful rather than kind. Naomi shifted the duffel higher. She looked to the stairs, then to a low door beneath them, the root cellar kind. A hook held it shut. She eased it up. Stale, cold, and the smell of old paint rose. A crawl into under kitchen darkness or into nowhere. Options are worth more than comfort. The knob at the top of the stairs turned with the slow interest of someone who believes in his own authority. Knuckles. A practiced cadence. "Police?" a voice said. "We have questions about a missing person." Lawrence closed his eyes and set his teeth. The sentence turned a key in something that had been locked behind them for years. Naomi touched his sleeve. Not a comfort. A correction. A human hand, reminding muscle that stillness can be chosen. He swallowed and nodded once. A man agreeing with his own spine. The knock came again, heavier. Then a click that belonged to a tool rather than a hand. Naomi's breath slowed. She raised the light and looked along the back wall. Another high basement window crouched, half buried in the drift. The motif repeating, because careful women arrange the world that way. She moved to it and set the flathead to the putty, turning with care, the way a mother's hand learns to cradle and to pry. The glass surrendered in a neat corner. She cupped the broken piece so it would not sing to the floor. Snow nosed in and then pressed, the drift eager to prove its usefulness. Outside, the street lay with its porches and the patient, quiet car. Inside, the polite voice borrowed the next line of law. Open up. We only want to talk. Only is a sharp word when carried by men who do not stand where you stand, Naomi thought. She slid her shoulders through the gap into the drift. The cold took her in its mouth. She pushed aside snow with her forearm, and the world above appeared as a pale plain, under a sky the color of steel. She turned, reached back for Zoe, felt the small body come without question, and pulled her into the night. The child became weight and then motion, the way stone learns to roll when told. Lawrence came last, breath tearing a little, hands clumsy with cold. But he came. Above, a hinge gave a wounded sound as the door opened to strangers. A beam stroked the basement and paused the way. A thought pauses when it believes it is already right. Headlights swept the yard in a careless arc, found nothing they knew how to name, and moved on. Naomi kept them low along the foundation where shadow layered shadow. The duffel thumped her hip in a rhythm that felt like purpose. She saw their first set of prints, already softening under new fall. The front of the house glowed faintly where ice had polished the glass. Somewhere down the block, the quiet car exhaled. Somewhere inside the door, the careful voice rehearsed its next polite threat. We will not be here for it, Naomi said under her breath. We go again. Same rules. Zoe nodded, breath white and narrow. Lawrence nodded too, his face thinner and somehow truer in the unkind light. They moved along the wall to the side gate, into a strip of yard the plow never touched, where fresh snow gripped because it had not yet learned to lie. Naomi felt the pull of the street and the pull of the truth, sealed in bags and in ink against her side, and she chose both. Behind them, the polite voice tried a bolder tone. Ahead, the night opened into a corridor of oaks and porches and unasked questions. A set of headlights lifted and slid across the facades, bright as a blade. Naomi set her jaw and stepped into the white, not toward rest but toward the urgency that makes morning possible. Snow leaned into the clapboard and pressed along the narrow seam of shadow as Naomi guided them past the shed that sagged like an exhausted friend. Breath left their mouths in thin white threads that snapped and were gone. She paused with her palm against the siding, not to steady herself, but to listen with her hand. Inside the red door house, boots thudded in patient squares. A voice she had learned to distrust asked a question in a tone so courteous it felt like a glove over a blade. The house did not answer. Listening is not obedience, she thought, and let the sound pass through her, like a draft through old brick. They crouched in the lee. The wind surrendered there and left a small chamber of quiet. Zoe tucked the rabbit beneath her chin and matched her breathing to Naomi's slow count. Lawrence kept one hand on the shed wall, not for balance but for witness, the way a person touches a headstone to say, I am here and I heard you. Beyond the fence, a dark sedan idled 3 houses down, its engine a low animal purr. No porch lights flared. No neighbor gleamed behind glass with a phone. Maple Avenue performed indifference, which is a kind of complicity when night is hunting. Naomi eased the duffel open just enough for the marker and the small notebook stained with oil. She lettered the present tense on the page with square, steady strokes. Red door house. 2 men inside. Quiet car to the east. She underlined quiet and closed the book. A record is a spine. When pressure bends you, a spine remembers your shape. She studied the meter on the wall, the rigid conduit to earth, the weatherhead, where the service dropped from sky to roof. Instinct proposed the simple switch to darkness. Experience answered that darkness invites pride. Pride makes men hurry. Hurry breaks things, and then punishes the nearest body. She would not give them that dare. Trade minutes, not force hands, she whispered. The girl lifted her gaze, wide and grave and steady. We hold here. Naomi said, we leave no words hanging in the air. If I touch your shoulder, you go exactly where my hand points. If I say stone, you are weight and cannot be moved. Zoe nodded once, like a worker taking a job that matters and not asking for praise. Lawrence stared at the house the way a man looks at a childhood photograph, seeing what is there and what is missing, and not trusting either. Naomi set her fingers on his sleeve, and he returned to the cold present with a breath that did not tremble. Can you wait? She asked. I can wait, he said. I have been waiting for years. Now I know what for. They held. Inside, the men moved room to room with a rhythm that belonged to training and a confidence that belonged to money. Rosalyn had counted on both. She had bet that men who worship speed would mistrust the handcrafted. She had wagered that a wall of pins and yarn and paper would look like a hobby rather than a weapon. Naomi felt the respect rise in her like heat from a pipe. You used their laziness against them, she thought. You built a machine out of slowness and hands. A hinge complained softly. The front door shut with careful manners. Tires whispered on snow. The polite voice drifted down the block and dissolved. Naomi waited 3 breaths and then moved. They slid to the basement window. The winter plastic peeled with a sound like paper giving up. Cold kissed their wrists as they climbed through. Inside, the air held that dry, clean cedar scent again, the same quiet signature she had found in the lockbox plastic at the warehouse. Systems, not speeches. She cupped the flashlight and climbed the steps. At the hall door, she pressed the backs of her fingers to the wood and waited for the faint tremor of footsteps. Nothing. She turned the knob with that careful speed that refuses to squeal, and stepped into dim. The house listened and then allowed them, the way a cautious dog decides to accept a hand. The sheets over furniture turned the room into soft shapes. A lamp with a crooked shade leaned like a shrug. The cold deepened as they climbed. At the end of the hall, a room waited with a desk and a wall that looked like a brain made visible. The corkboard filled the space. Photos marched in sober rows. A city map was cut and taped and marked until it looked like veins beneath skin. Yarn tied faces to buildings and dates to signatures. Under the pins sat small, neat notes that did not try to persuade so much as declare. Concealed transaction. Zoning exception. Silent partner. Evan smiled from the center. Not larger than the rest. Only central. As if gravity had been stolen. The lakefront developer appeared again. The councilman, with his careful smile, returned. Each image wore a thin belt of numbers and place. A modest testimony that survived even when boasts rot. Naomi felt the relief of pattern proven by patience. Rosalyn had built a low-tech cathedral to truth, not because she could not code, but because she understood how men like these dismiss what they cannot index. A wall like this looks quaint to rushed eyes. To a patient mind, it is a circuit that closes. On the desk lay a folder labeled Insurance in a hand that made a promise without flourish. Naomi opened it. The paper inside carried the clean date and the voice of a woman who does not waste ink. If you are reading this, something has happened to me. My name is Rosalyn Keene. I have placed evidence in safe locations. If Lawrence is with you, tell him I am sorry. Tell him he was right to believe in goodness, even when I was not sure it remained. Trust Naomi Carter. She is braver than she thinks. The line with her name tilted the room, and then steadied it. Naomi read it again. She felt the recognition slide under her ribs like a brace. Not prophecy, design. Someone had studied the way courage behaves and left it a doorway. She took out her phone. The battery had been cold and the power asleep. She did not wake the radio. She woke only the glass. The screen stayed silent and dark to the world beyond the room. But the lens lived. Naomi framed the sentence naming her and took one still photo and then one more, the way she always shot a panel before closing it. Not for pride, for proof. She powered the glass back down. Care is a procedure. She slid the letter into a clear bag and wrote place and hour, and her initials along the seam with that square, steady hand. Then she stopped. Strategy is not only possession, it is theater. She eased the letter back into the folder and returned the folder to the exact angle it had kept on the desk. A small courtesy to the enemy's future certainty. She would carry the image. They would find an undisturbed room and believe absence. A board spoke in the hall. Not weather. Wait. Naomi killed the beam and the screen, and the dark rose and embraced them. She breathed once, twice, then touched Zoe's sleeve. Stone. The child's body learned its lesson and became weight against the floor. Lawrence placed his palm flat on the desk, and his breath drew small. A man cutting his noise to the minimum a life requires. Naomi leaned to the doorframe and set an eye to the sliver. A cone of light brushed the far wall and paused, as if collecting scent. The courteous voice murmured something pleased, and the cone moved on. They will sweep twice, she thought. The first to wake the dust, the second to bless their own conclusions. She put the folder back and let the room hold its shape. She took 3 square photos of the board, quick and faithful, not a souvenir, a geogram. She touched the duffel, felt the sealed drive and the photos, with their stamped time and place, felt the letter's image in the sleeping phone, and felt the cedar in the air. Not sermon. Enough. We go now. She breathed at Zoe's ear. Same way. No light. Zoe nodded in the dark, and Naomi felt the nod the way one feels a pulse under a wrist. They moved along the stair edges, the places Wood complains least. At the kitchen, Naomi met the door with her eyes first. The deadbolt glared with pride. She did not argue. She untaught it. The flathead found the screws on the strike plate and turned them the smallest fraction, enough to make the bolt's mouth less sure of itself. The latch sighed open, like someone changing their mind. They stepped into the yard. Fresh snow waited, honest and clean. Behind them, the men made a new sound, the friction tone of professionals, discovering a room that refuses to behave like a wound. Naomi did not gift them the satisfaction of an answer. She led her small company to the hedge. The quiet sedan lifted its nose in a courteous sniff and settled. At the truck, she lifted Zoe into the back and fastened the belt with careful force. Lawrence folded in beside the quilt with the dignity of a man who insists on being a person, even when pain campaigns to make him a problem. The engine shuddered and then agreed. Naomi kept the lights low. The sedan fell in behind them like a shadow that had learned to talk. She did not chase speed. She purchased time. She took the right tires to the shoulder, where new snow still held its grip, and let physics obey her patience. The tail tried the worn grooves, and slid, and corrected, donating minutes to her cause. Make them pay with time, she told herself again. Time is the bribe money hates. Detective Zoe is counting cars. Came the whisper from behind. The quiet kind. Good count, Naomi said, and felt steadier. The houses thinned as the city leaned toward the river, and then toward fields and dark industry. Snow sifted fresh, as if the sky had decided it would not stop until daylight forced it to. In her chest, the idea of the church rose, not as tactic but as meaning. A place without power, where silence had been official for a century, where air remembered singing, even when no one was left to sing, a place to keep a promise for a man who had finally found a thing he would not let go. She turned toward the road that lifted to the crooked spire. The steps would be drifted, the side window would be tired, the nave would hold cold like a held breath, but the roof would still be a roof, and the pews would hold weight, and the air would make space for vows. She pictured the plan, the way she pictured a panel diagram before cutting juice. Side window, blanket against glass, keep the beam low, make a bed where the floor is strongest, lay the proof against the warm side of her body, and keep it alive. Do the work. Lawrence watched the road with the gaze of a man who had finally met the cost and signed with his own name. He touched the duffel with one hand, not to claim it but to bless it. Then he exhaled in a way that completed a long sentence. "I will be a weight now," he said, voice thin and certain. "But you are meant to carry this." Naomi did not look over. She pressed her palms to the wheel and let the words wire themselves into her. "You are weight," she thought, "not a burden, a purpose with mass. I carry people. I carry proof. I carry what I promised." The spire lifted from the dark like a finger, reminding the sky to keep its end of the bargain. The road bent and she took it. The headlights found steps drowned in soft white. The quiet car's engine was a rumor now, not a presence. She did not assume mercy. She assumed more work waiting after this work. She parked with the nose to the wind and reached for the flathead. The cold bit her wrist, and she welcomed the bite. It meant she was still here to be hurt and to answer. "Old snow lies," she said aloud, soft as a prayer. "Fresh snow grips. Truth repeats until it builds a road. Tonight we drive it into morning." The church crouched on its hill like an animal in winter, ribs showing through boarded windows, breath thin but present. Naomi parked with the nose into the wind and let the engine go quiet until the metal ticked itself down to stillness. Snow gathered the last of the sound and swallowed it, the way thick insulation swallows hum. She cupped the flashlight so its light became a hush instead of a blade, and found the side window where the old putty had given up. The flathead remembered the seam. The glass lifted with a small surrendered sigh, and a clean edge of cold slid over her wrists. She fed Zoe through first. The child's boots touched the floor and learned it in a single hollow note, then stood still the way a pupil waits for the teacher to speak. Lawrence followed with a breath that fractured. One hand braced on the sill, eyes trying to focus on the dark, as if it might answer to his name. Naomi came last and eased the window down to a winter's gap, enough for scent and rumor, not enough for shape. Dust lived in the air with old varnish and the faint ghost of wax. Pews held two steady rows, backs turned toward a silence that would have to be enough. "Set your feet," Naomi whispered. "Only talk if I ask. Stay close." Zoe's mitten found the hem of her coat and anchored there. Lawrence set the lockbox on the end of a pew, then on the floor, then on the floor again, as if he had to tell his hand twice. His breath rasped. The cold had crawled deeper into him than quilts could argue with. Naomi shook out 2 quilts from the duffel, and 1 canvas painter's drop she kept for ugly jobs. She built a nest under the lee of the nearest pew, where the wind could reach only by rumor. She added the old wool coat they had lifted from Rosalyn's chair. The coat held that quiet cedar note again, the same as the lockbox plastic and the house with the red door. Systems, not speeches, she thought. A woman had left a trail of care you could smell, she said, patting the canvas. "We build the warm where the wood is strongest." Lawrence eased himself into the hollow she had made with the care of a man entering a decision he did not want but would not refuse. He lay on his side and pressed his palms together under his chin as if prayer had outlived belief. by habit alone. Naomi braced the lockbox against the inner side of the pew, draped the quilt to turn its outline into nothing interesting, then took the drive from the inner pocket and placed it under her shirt against her skin. Warmth holds charge, she thought. Cold steals. She was not only carrying proof now, her body had become the protection of it. Zoe crouched and set Pepper beside Lawrence's sleeve, a ridiculous and exact offering. He saw it and managed a smile that was mostly memory. "He is very brave," Zoe said. "He is," Naomi answered. "He came through the storm." Wood spoke in the rafters. Not the footfall of strangers, just the building, telling its old story. Naomi let her body loose one notch and stripped 2 chemical warmers from a pouch, snapped one to life with her thumb and laid it along the pulse at his wrist, tucked the other beneath his tongue, the way shelter nurses had taught her years ago. Enough heat, not too much. Cold can trick a body into false comfort and final sleep. "Hands," she said softly to Zoe. The girl held them out. Naomi pressed the small fingers between her palms until pink sprang back like a small sunrise. Zoe did not ask. She absorbed the steps and filed them the way a careful child files rules that might save someone later. Courage is a habit, and habits teach themselves to small eyes. Naomi took out the notebook with the oil stain and opened it on her knee. She printed with square strokes that kept their shape, even when her hands wanted to shake. She wrote the place and the hour by the church's own clock in her head. Wrote the state of each of them in few words. Knife inside pocket, flathead in sleeve, zip bags ready, drive warm against skin, phones dark, window sealed, hand tight. The pen scratched loud in the big quiet. The act steadied her, the way tightening a terminal steadies a line. Connection makes current honest. A frayed bell rope hung from the belfry like a sentence someone forgot to finish. The wind moved it once, and the rope whispered against wood. A small sound that filled the room anyway, like time asking a question. Naomi set the flashlight on its tail and angled the beam into the quilt so the space glowed dusk instead of glare. She let the shadows learn their corners again. "Tell me again," she said, and watched Lawrence's eyes try to clear. Names, places, the way a lie walks when it thinks it is alone. He blinked, and some fog thinned. "Pills in the vitamins," he said. "Forget the files. Forget the names. Sign this." They moved the money through accounts we never opened. They used my signature, but it does not loop its letter that way. Rosalyn kept the old servers alive when they told her to bury them. She printed photographs. Photographs do not crash. She said their laziness would save us. It did, Naomi said. It is saving us now. Zoe tilted her head to Naomi's arm. "I can count the breaths," she whispered. "Count them," Naomi said, and felt the rightness of it. Numbers as love, the kind that rocks a body without moving it. Snow hissed against the boards and kept hissing, long and patient. Far out on the road, a plow muttered its slow oath and passed. The church breathed like a creature that had outlived its purpose and kept its manners. Naomi slowed her own lungs to match the room. Her fingers wanted to fidget. She let them inventory instead. Marker, zip bags, napkins, 2 receipts already stapled, one with the plate digits, one with the hour by the warehouse vent. She touched each the way a boxer touches the rope, to remember the ring's shape with eyes closed. Her mind jumped forward to light and heat and coffee she did not deserve, and a phone that wanted coins. And she hauled it back by the collar. Here first, then road, then harbor light with its neon that never truly sleeps. Then the card in her wallet from a woman who asked too many questions in a storm months ago and handed out a promise like a spare key. "If you ever have a story that matters." Naomi pressed her thumb against the crease where the card lived. Small, hard promise. Lawrence's breath broke and found itself again. His eyes watched her hands the way a traveler watches a map. He swallowed and winced. I thought I had years to be brave, he said. Turns out, I had minutes. Minutes are enough, Naomi said. Minutes make mornings. He smiled for real then, smaller than grief and bigger than fear. You sound like her. She told me, courage is keeping one promise when everything argues. Naomi looked at Zoe and the lockbox and the bell rope and the drive warming under her shirt. I can do that, she said. She felt the sentence seat itself inside her, square and weight-bearing. He wet his lips. Promise me something, he said. Voice, thin but iron. Anything, Naomi said, and meant the word. Find Rosalyn. Do not let grief make you quiet. If she is gone, find what she left, where she knew I would look. Give it to the ones who can still be helped. Do not let him own the story. Naomi lifted the notebook and printed the words as he spoke them, side by side, with the place and the hour. She wrote the line, Find Rosalyn. She wrote, Do not let grief make you quiet. She wrote the vow as a record, not a prayer, made it part of the chain for the morning to hold. Then she closed the book and set her palm over the cover. I promise, she said. He whispered. His hand found Zoe's. His fingers closed once and fell open like a door unlatching. His eyes half closed and lifted with stubbornness. Then the stubbornness went out of them, and a calm settled that had nothing to do with comfort. Naomi pressed her hand to his chest and felt the last lift and fall the way a technician feels a relay travel to the end of its throw. The room changed scent in a way old buildings understand, lowering into a new kind of quiet. The rope gave one small whisper and was still. Naomi did not speak. The silence did not need help. Is he sleeping? Zoe asked, voice level. He is resting now, Naomi said, choosing the whole truth. Her voice could carry. Will he see angels? He already has, Naomi said, and let that be the language the night could stand. She drew the quilt over his face with careful hands and smoothed the wool the way a mother smooths hair before school. She wrote the hour again. She wrote the place again. Repetition makes a record harder to erase. She took the phone from her pocket, kept it dark, woke only the glass, and framed the scene with the sleeping lens. Quilt, lockbox, one photograph, and one more. Not for strangers, for saving the shape of the moment when doubt comes later with its sandpaper. She gathered the papers into a heavier bag and printed on the seam in those same square strokes. She spoke the checksum of the drive under her breath like a psalm. Not ceremony, memory that would not rub away when fear had its turn. She pressed the drive closer to her skin and felt the cold on the outside and the warmth inside answer the balance. Warmth holds charge. Cold steals. I will be the warmth, she thought. I will be the body that keeps the truth alive until morning can take its share. We say goodbye now, she told Zoo, fast and gentle. Good night, Mr. Lawrence, the child said, and laid Pepper against the fold of quilt. The words were a clean bowl. No performance. Enough weight. Naomi packed with motions, smoothed by work. Knife to the side. Flathead to the sleeve. Bag low and center. Marker slid into the spiral of the notebook. She pulled the drop cloth higher to make absence look old. Then she looked at the window, where snow winked at the gap, as if eager to finish the job the storm had started. She looked at the road, a white tunnel promising grip. She looked at the diner she could see in her mind, the neon like a tired halo, the corner booth, the smell of coffee and bacon she could not afford, the payphone by the gas station, the taste of cold metal on the mouthpiece, the voice that would wake faster than a normal person. She squeezed Zoe's mitten once. "We go," she said. "Quiet. We do not look back. Looking back is loud. Detective Zoe is ready." The girl answered. They moved to the window. Naomi lifted the sash and fed the duffel through. Then the child. Then herself. The cold bit clean and honest. The truck answered her key and kept its lights modest. The oaks along the drive arched like ribs over a city that had learned to live with winter. Naomi steered for the road, felt the tires settle into fresh snow, felt the grip answer like a promise kept. She spoke as they rolled down from the hill, not raising her voice, setting the words like stones across a stream. "We are not running to hide," she said. "We are running to keep the truth moving." Harbor Light held to the bend of the avenue like a small ship in gray water, its neon hum a tired halo against the pre-dawn. Naomi slid the truck under the sign and let the engine tick itself quiet. Snow sat in low shoulders along the curb. The windows sweated a buttery light that made the street feel less like a threat and more like a pause. She turned to Zoe and set the rules the way a craftsperson sets tools on a bench. "We go in small and fast, coat zipped, hands on the table. If I touch your shoulder, you listen with your feet." Zoe nodded, solemn as a clerk at opening time, and hugged Pepper to her ribs. Inside smelled of burnt coffee, hot iron, and maple that had met too many pans. A short bell spoke when the door admitted them. The waitress looked up with the practiced kindness of a person who has seen all kinds of exhaustion and decided to honor it anyway. "Pick your corner," she said, and slid 2 mugs to her end of the counter, as if the morning had already chosen. Naomi took the back booth beneath the neon flicker. The vinyl had a careful line of tape along one crack, repair made plain. She ordered pancakes for Zoe, coffee black for herself, and a glass of hot water. Then she pulled the damp business card from her wallet. The name was still sharp in the cheap ink. Rachel Diaz. Investigative. The letters had not bled in her pocket. That felt like a small sign for people who do not believe in signs. The payphone waited in the side vestibule where wind bit knuckles. The handset tasted like cold metal and old sugar. The line rang twice, and then a voice woke without apology. "Rachel Diaz. This is Naomi Carter, the electrician," Naomi said. "You told me to call if I ever had a story that mattered." A small, quiet. Then the voice found an edge. "Where are you?" "Harbor Light, Lake Avenue, corner booth under the neon. Stay there. Do not talk to anyone you do not have to. I am on my way." Naomi set the phone back and stood in the wind to count 3 breaths. Then she returned to the booth. Zoe's plate had arrived, pancakes edged in crisp, with butter melting like proof of warmth. Naomi poured hot water over a tea bag the color of old leaves and felt the cup breathe against her fingers. Her own coffee stared dark and honest, and would not save her teeth, but might save her eyes. She laid the oil-stained notebook beside the sugar shaker and printed the hour and the place in square strokes that kept their shape. She wrote that she had called. She wrote that Rachel had answered. She wrote that Rachel was coming now, and underlined now once. Chain begins with a line any tired person can read, she thought. The act steadied her the way tightening a terminal steadies a line. Connection makes current honest. The doorbell spoke, and a woman came in, with snow braided into her hair and a coat that had walked through more than weather. She looked around not like prey, but like someone who counts exits as a habit. When her eyes reached Naomi's, they stopped moving. "Naomi," Rachel said, sliding into the bench opposite, her voice low and clean. "Tell me what you have and what you cannot lose." Naomi touched her shirt, where the drive warmed the space above her heart. "I have a small thing that holds a large thing," she said. "I have photographs with printed time and place. I have a promise. I cannot lose any of them. Rachel said, We will copy without touching more than we must. May I sit beside you? Naomi moved to the far side, and Rachel joined her. So the table became a shared desk. Rachel unzipped a canvas pouch and laid out objects the size of pockets and seriousness. A right blocker, the shape of a deck of cards. A short cable coiled like a question. A laptop with tape over its camera and a sticker where a brand used to be. A flat light that could read without shouting. Her hands moved with the calm of someone who has broken bad habits on purpose. I do not plug anything straight, Rachel said. The blocker touches the port. The cable touches the blocker. The machine only listens. It does not speak. That way, no dates change. That way, no lawyer can say we wrote what we only read. Naomi nodded. Warmth holds charge, she said without meaning to. Cold steals. Rachel's mouth tilted once in a way that meant respect. Keep the drive against you until the last second, Rachel said. Then we move like a relay. The waitress appeared with a fresh pot, and the kind of glance that asks a question without making you answer. Refill, she asked, and Naomi said yes, please, and Rachel said thank you, and the pot made a sound like rain on a metal roof. The woman left without touching anything else, and Naomi felt grateful, as if for a priest who understands that ritual does not require explanation. Ready, Rachel said. Naomi reached under her shirt and brought the drive out fast, so the air could not steal more than it could help. Rachel accepted it like a fragile instrument and clicked it into the blocker. Her machine woke a quiet screen. Letters and numbers would fill it, but Naomi kept her focus on the shape of the work rather than the shapes of the glyphs. We verify first, Rachel murmured. The machine will speak the sum of the bits. We write that sum down. Then we copy. Then we ask the machine to speak the sum again. If the sums match, the copy is true. If they argue, we begin again with different cables. Naomi set the notebook under her hand and waited for the screen to finish its count. Rachel spoke the hash aloud in an even cadence, blocks of characters like prayer beads. Naomi wrote each block in square letters, not trusting her ears to remember, without a shape she could see. When the last block landed, Rachel nodded. Read it back. Naomi read the blocks with the same steady rhythm. Rachel tapped, and the copy began. The progress moved like a glacier. Zoe counted breaths and drew a rabbit face in the window steam with one careful finger. The room went on feeding men with lunch pails, and men with empty hands, and one woman eating 2 eggs, like a person recovering from a verdict. I will call 3 desks when we finish, Rachel said quietly. I do not like one door that can be locked. I prefer 3 doors in 3 buildings and a stairwell besides. We send it once. We make it harder to separate truth from attention. You sound like her, Naomi said, surprising herself. Like who? Rosalyn. Systems, not speeches. Rachel let the small tilt of the mouth return. I admired her work from a distance, she said. She kept notes that made the city feel watched in the right way. He died last night, Naomi said, and the words were heavy and clean, in a church without power. He asked me to find her. He told me, do not let grief make you quiet. Rachel did not reach across the table. She changed nothing in her body. She only said, I am sorry, in a voice that belonged in a room that does not punish grief. The first copy finished, and the second sum began. She read the blocks again. Naomi wrote them beneath the first. They matched the way a lock matches a key when metal is honest. Chain of custody, Rachel said. We write the hour. We write the place. We write who gave and who took, and who held what for how long. We initial where our names will have to stand later when the room is not this warm. Naomi pulled a napkin from the metal holder and flattened it with the side of her hand. She printed the diner name and the street and the hour, spelled in words because words resist more hands. Naomi Carter transfers one verified copy to Rachel Diaz for publication and protective dispersal. Original returned to Naomi Carter. Witnessed by, she slid the pen. Rachel signed with letters that did not try to impress. Naomi signed with the same square hand that had wired new panels and written past due on envelopes, and carved Zoe's name into school forms like a promise. Staples, Naomi said, and the waitress seemed to hear, with that second sense common to people who serve. She brought a stapler from near the till and set it down as if placing a relic with respect. Naomi stapled the napkin to the receipt for coffee and pancakes and hot water, money and truth on one paper. She underlined the hour once and wrote the hash along the edge where grease would not find it. She slid the napkin into a zip bag and pressed the seal until it bit. The small sound satisfied the part of her brain that loves a breaker seating tight. Rachel slipped the copy into her pouch and made a second and a third. One for a desk by the river, one for a desk over the tracks, one for a desk kept by a woman who learned to laugh quietly when threatened. She spoke no names, and Naomi heard all of them anyway. Not safe, she thought. Responsible. We are not done, Rachel said. This is only the first turn of a bolt. I need your phone dark and your truck away from any place you sleep. I need you visible where there are eyes and receipts. I need you to let me be loud for you, because that is the part I know how to do. Not if quiet makes lies easy, Naomi said. I will stand where there are eyes and receipts. Warmth holds charge. Cold steals. I will keep it warm and in the open. Rachel nodded once, like a craftsperson approving a method. Her phone thrummed once and then again. She glanced and placed it face down. The first door is open, she said. The second will open before noon. The third will come late and pretend it planned the party first. Let them all have it. Let them fight over who gets to tell the truth loudest. A man came in and took a stool without taking off his coat. Rachel's eyes noted him and went calm. She closed the pouch and lifted her coffee as if this were any morning. Naomi mirrored the performance. She counted the coins and left more than the bill asked to pay for staplers and mercy. We leave by separate doors, Rachel said without moving her mouth. I will go through the kitchen and out the alley. You take the side and circle to the truck. Do not run, running announces. Walk like a person with somewhere to be and time enough to get there. Naomi gathered the notebook, the bag, the child. Zoe wiped the rabbit face from the fogged glass with the back of her glove and nodded to Pepper, as if to say, job done. Naomi touched Rachel's sleeve. Thank you, she said. Do not thank me yet, Rachel answered. Wait until the doors click behind the men who did this. Naomi took the side door. The cold met her face like a slap from someone who loves you enough to wake you. The truck waited under its rhyme. A Sedan idled a block down, patient as a hunter who has mistaken patience for power. She buckled Zoe in and felt the neat click like the seating of a breaker. She kept the lights low and pulled into the street with the grace of a tired but careful person. She steered toward a morning that would not wait, a day made of errands and signatures and eyes, and said the quiet sentence that had become a mission and a map. We are not running to hide. We are running to keep the truth moving. By the time the gray morning climbed the windows, the city tasted like iron and thaw. Naomi kept to places with clocks and cash drawers and people who looked up when a door opened. Warmth holds charge. Cold steals, she reminded herself. The drive a small pulse against her skin. The stapled napkin, a steady square in her notebook like a nameplate on a breaker. News found them even with her phone asleep. The bodega televisions spilled their light over stacked fruit and bread racks, and the anchor changed to that careful voice that belongs to a moment when a room leans forward. Cameras sat outside a glass tower and watched black jackets move through a lobby bright as a clean operating room. A gloved hand lifted a clear bag, and a clerk's stamp bit down. Naomi did not smile. She felt the click inside that said a bolt had seated. Not joy. Not yet, but confirmation with edges. She took Zoe to the diner again, because counters and coffee and a bell above a door make a kind of public that lies do not love. The waitress with the calm eyes set down toast and a newspaper without commentary. Like ritual. Inside the paper, the long bones of data showed themselves as though an X-ray had been held to the morning. Audit trails. Receipt copies. Mail headers with dates and roads through servers that do not forgive. Down the bottom of the screen crawl on the television moved a sequence about frozen accounts and search warrants and boxes labeled with careful numbers and initials. Naomi wrote what the screen showed in square letters that did not wobble. Time of the evidence, mark spoken on air, letters seen on bag. The place where the camera caught the wall clock reflected in the glass. She did not let her hand hurry. A line written slow behaves better later. Rachel arrived by the payphone without walking through the door. The waitress tipped her chin, and Naomi stepped into the vestibule, where cold breathes like a second person. Rachel spoke as if crossing a river with a light held high. First door propped open, she said. Second door standing under its own weight. Third door, trying to claim it, built the house. Her voice held a lean, dry humor and a hard frame. Then she added the part that moved the air. Timestamps are the bones of truth. We gave them ribs and a spine. They linked to the audit log and the checksum. No one can swallow that and pretend it tastes like rumor. Naomi let that sentence set. Then Rachel gave the part that made the room feel narrower. In one of the backup sets, we found a mailbox with other kinds of notes. Surveillance logs, photographs with night glass in them, your truck at your block, time stamped, weeks of it. The federal hands care about money. The men who hired watchers care about addresses. Naomi kept her voice even. Which watcher? Rachel named a private outfit that prefers invoices to insignia, and Naomi pressed the sound of it into the wood of her mind until it left a dent. You are safer in a place with eyes and receipts than on any road with trees, Rachel said. If a badge asks to help, you choose a counter with a till between you and a clock above it and a camera that blinks red, not blue. Patricia is ready if you must shift. Soup on the stove. Locks that have been tested. But if you can, stand in the open and let Noon do some work for us. They went back to the booth, and Naomi watched the map grow. Lines tied shell companies to addresses like red thread on cork, and then tied those to names spoken without the polish of a gala. A ribbon cutting from years ago flashed on the screen. A younger Lawrence smiling next to a woman with dark curls and eyes that did not flinch for ceremonial scissors. The crawl beneath said backups preserved off premises, and the word preserved landed like a verdict, written in pencil, and then traced in ink. The camera found Naomi by accident and intention, both. The microphone waited like a bird on a rail. She kept the encounter inside the doorway where the bell talks and the coffee smells like truth. Are you Naomi Carter? Did you provide a drive to journalists this morning? I provided copies for safekeeping and publication. The original remains with me. Do you fear for your safety or that of your child? I fear for silence, she said. Lies grow well in it. We will stand where there are eyes and receipts. The woman with the microphone blinked once, as if the sentence had let the room hear its own temperature, and then thanked her and backed away, so a man in a work coat could pass. At the table, Naomi stapled the receipt for toast to the napkin with her transfer note. Money and truth on one paper, she thought, and the staple bite felt like a seal. Zoe leaned into her side and whispered that Pepper liked the cinnamon roll and would like a bite more if it did not trouble anyone. Naomi tore off a small corner and placed it on the plate as if feeding a story something sweet for its nerves. By late morning, the second door had opened the way Rachel promised, and national voices that usually enjoyed their own reflections started saying words like independent verification and internal controls and donor intent. A former federal someone in a gray suit explained chain of custody with the round certainty of a mechanic discussing torque settings. Naomi touched the ridged plastic of the bag in her pocket and felt seen by a stranger who would never know her face. When the crawl finally slipped her name into its sentence, it did so the way a rivet sits in a beam. A local electrician facilitated transmission of corroborating materials to independent outlets. Not heroine, not saint, not any word that would make a parade necessary. Just a function performed with hands and squares and timings. It fit. Then the other timing arrived, the one that mattered to her more than any crawl. Rachel called again, in a voice one shade softer, and said the raid footage showed the hour. The bog of money began to be walked, and also that the watchers had plotted a map of Naomi and her small daughter, made of nights and corners and fuel receipts someone would later submit with no shame. The federal warrant had a net for accounts, but the men with patience and hired cars had a net for doorways. That was the turn that tightens a throat. So Naomi did the math that belongs to mothers and to people who respect procedures. She kept herself visible where cash drawers and stainless steel made reflective witnesses, and when the afternoon began to thin, she moved toward Patricia, because locks and soup are not symbols when danger has a budget. The safe house door opened under a hand that knows how to listen at night. Inside smelled of coffee, laundry, and onions that had learned to soften in a pot. Zoe fell asleep with a spoon in her hand, because children can invent rest wherever safety sits down. Patricia touched Naomi's elbow with an approval that felt like being included in a very quiet union. The news did not stop just because soup did its work. Screens said federal custody for one name and counsel for another, saying cooperation with the kind of smile a man wears when trying on humility. The anchor read quotes that tried to make smoke sound like breath. Naomi finished her bowl and stood to rinse it, because work is a way to keep from shaking. Her phone, allowed to wake, now that the loud part was already out in the world. Breathed once. A text from a number that had been made for this day. If you want to hear from a ghost, the message said. The red door. The words did not dress themselves in drama. They sat in the center of the screen with the certainty of a clock. Naomi put the phone face down on the table and pressed her palm over the small stack she carried everywhere now. Thumb on the paper heart Zoe had made at the library, fingers on the sealed napkin bag, heel of her hand over the small, warm drive that had been a weight and a promise both. She told Patricia, without decoration. Patricia nodded, like a person who knots rope by feel. This house holds, she said. It will hold again. Leave the heavy things here that are not meant to travel. Take only what must move. Naomi layered the protections the way a craftsperson layers tape and heat shrink. The original stayed under Patricia's lock with a note that would make sense to a stranger with a good badge. One copy stayed in Rachel's orbit, already singing in print and footage. The stapled napkin and the notebook came with her because a mission needs words and squares. Zoe woke enough to nod at the plan, as if approving a blueprint. Dusk arrived like breath held. Naomi zipped boots and gloves and checked the small screwdriver in her coat, as if it were a talisman carved from work. She knelt to Zoe's level. We are going to step into the cold and keep going, she said. We are not running to hide. We are running to keep the truth moving. Who had learned to count more than numbers this week, squeezed Pepper, and said that detectives sometimes meet in the dark if the story asks them to. They left before night completed itself, because any appointment with a ghost belongs to the seam between colors. The truck hummed like a good machine when the key turned. Streets wore that blue-hour sheen that makes even bad corners look briefly honest. When Naomi turned onto the block with the oak, the red door waited with its own small gravity, paint softened by years, threshold clean, as if someone had dreamed of sweeping. Far down the street, a car idled without lights, the patience of hired men mistaking quiet for control. Naomi parked where witnesses would exist if anyone bothered to look out of their windows. She took one slow breath and felt heat rise where the drive had rested all day. Warmth holds charge. Cold steals. She had given the world the bones of truth and kept enough warmth to make them stand. She touched Zoe's curl and steadied her own hands. Then she stepped into the winter, toward the red door, toward the next turn of the bolt. The oak drew thin lines across the snow as the wind shifted, a slow hand writing and erasing in the same motion. Naomi let the truck's heater breathe once over her knuckles, then killed the engine and listened to the block, a patient idle somewhere down the street, a porch chain knocking wood, nothing else. Zoe watched the house with the red door, the way a child watches a stage before a curtain rises, calm and awake in a way beyond her years. Pepper tucked under her chin like a witness who would not talk. We go in small, Naomi said. We listen first. We do not argue with ghosts. Zoe nodded, solemn as a clerk at a counter. One hand on Pepper, one hand on your sleeve. They crossed the walk. The cold came up through the boards of the porch like a warning that belonged to the house and not to the weather. Naomi lifted her hand to knock. The door opened on the first breath of the motion, as if someone had been standing just inside, counting the seconds with her. Rosalyn stood in the doorway, older than the photograph and entirely herself. Winter in the hair, distance in the eyes, steadiness in the spine. She stepped back without a word, so the street would not be allowed to keep this moment. Naomi entered, Zoe at her hip, Pepper between them like a soft badge. Inside smelled of cedar and paper that has waited. A desk sat under the window. The corkboard was gone, but the clean rectangle it had left behind held the wall like a ghost of a map. Rosalyn turned the bolt with a practiced hand, and the lock accepted the instruction without noise. You made it, she said. We did. Naomi said, This is Zoe. Hello, Zoe whispered. Hello, Rosalyn answered. Warmth, without sugar. Kitchen to the right, back, exit clear. Top stair sticks. Window latches hold if you lift, then slide. Systems, not speeches. Naomi thought. She felt the drive under her shirt, a small live coin against skin, and set her palm over it without thinking. Warmth holds charge. Cold steals. She had learned to say it as a joke, and now it was a creed. Rosalyn moved to the desk and opened a small metal box. The hinges breathed once. She took out a folded packet. Paper yellowed at the edges with a crease worn by a careful thumb. She rested her hand on it like a blessing, then placed it on the desk between them. This is my confession, she said. Not a letter, a record. The threats, the fire, the names that were not printed, the reasons for the backups, the places I failed, the places I refused to fail. Every step they did not catch. Naomi did not touch it yet. She looked at the window, at the dull circle of the street lamp on the snow, at the distant shape of a car where night pretended to be empty. Rosalyn followed her glance and nodded once as if to say yes. The world keeps its rituals. so we will keep ours. Naomi opened her notebook and printed the hour and the place in square letters that did not waver. She wrote the purpose. She left a line for names, and another for signatures, and a line for transfer, and a line for retrieval. Then she set a clean, sealable bag beside the packet like a tray in a quiet rite. Chain first, Naomi said. Always. Rosalyn said. She pulled a pen from the desk drawer and wrote the transfer with the neat speed of someone who had built a life on lists. She signed small and steady, not a flourish in sight. Naomi initialed under it, printed the hour again, because hours behave best when written twice, then slid the confession into the bag and pressed the seal from one corner to the other until the ridge clicked all the way along. The sound was small and complete. She set her palm flat and felt the raised seam under the heel of her hand. "Are we building a promise?" Zoe asked, watching like an apprentice. "We are," Naomi said. "We are making it hold." Rosalyn watched the child with something that might have been relief, then reached into the box again and lifted a second envelope. Naomi's name was on it, in the same quick hand. The ink softened, where a thumb had once rested while deciding. From a time when planning was a form of hope, Rosalyn said, "I changed the name on the front a dozen times. Then I stopped changing it when your name would not leave my head. You came to fix a panel. You asked practical questions. You held your daughter like truth. If things went dark, I wanted a person who would keep a light for a minute longer than most." Naomi tucked the envelope into the notebook behind the page, where she had written the hour and the place, so the page would feel heavier and therefore harder to misplace. She looked up. "He died in a church without power," she said. "He asked me to find you. He made me write the hour. He told me not to let grief make me quiet." Rosalyn closed her eyes for a moment that belonged only to her. When she opened them, the grief had steadied but not left. "He always wanted to be brave," she said. "He did not always know how to be. You gave him that." "He gave it to himself," Naomi said. "We only held a door." They stood in that small room where cedar and dust wore the same patience, and for a half-minute the house felt like a sanctuary built from breath. Then a thin band of light slid across the far wall, a headlight line cutting a careful arc. Rosalyn tilted her head, a small, exact motion. "We keep this short," she said. "We do not give them a tableau. You have already done the hardest work. Now comes the work that keeps what you built from falling. Tell me the shape," Naomi said. "Rebuild the trust in function before you put a sign on the door." Rosalyn said, "Children need heat and shoes. Then the audits. Then the grants. Publish schedules. Publish hashes. Publish delivery times and signatures without speeches. Invite the city to audit you while you sleep. Ask the union to wire the building. Hang the receipts where sunlight can find them. Choose counsel that answers its own phone. Ask for a clerk with a spine." Naomi wrote while she listened. Each instruction, a line that made the page feel like a plan and not a wish. "Warm the rooms first," she said. "Exactly," Rosalyn said. "Courage without procedure is a bonfire. Procedure without courage is a ledger. You have both. That is why they will fail." She lifted a third paper, thinner, and slid it under the sealed confession as if it were a mat. "Lawrence's will," she said. "A stipend for Zoe, housing for a season, and then a fair lease with dignity. It is drafted. It will find you when the air clears. He wrote your name because he believed you would not sell it." Naomi felt that new weight land in her chest and settle where strength lives when it is tired. She kept writing. Outside, the light thinned and moved away. Somewhere, a door opened and closed, with the care of a hand pretending not to be a hand. Rosalyn's face shifted the way a good navigator reads a sky. "Exit now," she said. "We use the cellar, Snow erases more faithfully than men. Deposit the confession as discussed. Not tonight. Before noon, the small bank with the clock that runs a minute slow. The borrowed name. Do not let that minute become a habit. Naomi nodded once. She felt the drive against her skin and pressed it back to warmth. Warmth holds charge. Cold steals. A sentence made of work. Rosalyn stepped close enough that Naomi felt the soft heat of another person in winter. She set her palm over the place where the drive lay. Heat guarding heat for a second. Palm to promise. You do not need my blessing, Rosalyn said, but take it anyway. Keep the truth moving. Keep it moving in ways that make it hard to stop. Lists, clocks, counters, receipts, people who can look you in the eye when they hand you a key. Footsteps brushed snow somewhere near. Naomi lifted Zoe, and the girl wrapped herself around her with the calm skill of a child who has slept in more than one room. Pepper's ear ticked against Naomi's jaw. A small piece of cloth and comfort. What if they see us? Zoe whispered. Then we are still here, Naomi said. And there are eyes and receipts. Rosalyn opened the cellar door and led them down the narrow stairs. The air changed from house to storage, from story to ledger. At the small window she lifted the old sash and eased it out. Snow sighed as the seal broke. She cleared the drift with her forearms like a person who never waited for ceremony. She turned back, her face close and unromantic. Leave a letter under the red door if you need me, she said. No return address. One sentence. I will find it. Then I will find you. Naomi passed Zoe through. Then followed the sealed bag, a square against her ribs. The ridge, a little bone under her palm. Outside, the night opened like a held breath released. The oak lifted its arms with slow old grace. Far down the block, the patient car rolled away. Men choosing to waste time and pretending that was power. Rosalyn settled the sash and was a shadow behind glass for a heartbeat. She lifted a hand once. Not sentimental, simply clear. Then she moved through the dark house, the way a person moves who has rehearsed every exit. Naomi crossed the yard and felt the drive warm under her shirt like a pulse. Warmth holds charge. Cold steals. She repeated it, not for comfort, but to keep her hands steady on the work. At the fence, she turned once. The red door held its color even with the moon trying to make everything gray. It looked less like an escape and more like a post office for courage. Back in the truck, Zoe buckled herself with sleepy competence and set Pepper upright like a docile guard. Are we finished with ghosts? She asked. For tonight, Naomi said. Tomorrow, we work with people. Will it be warmer? Warmer than this, Naomi said. We will make it warmer. She drove with the deliberate calm of a person who has accepted a keyring that does not lie flat. At the first light, she set the notebook on the wheel and wrote the hour and the place and the transfer complete. Because writing makes shape, and shape resists forgetting. The phone breathed once. Rachel's line arrived and waited. First door still open. Second braced. Third, pretending loudly. Are you clear? Naomi typed slow so the letters would behave. Clear for tonight. Torch passed. Confession secured. Deposit in the morning. She slid the phone away and looked at the road and at Zoe and at her own hands. The city had a long night of men learning that patience had never been power. She had a morning of counters and clocks and clerks with spines. Soup waited at Patricia's. A lock would click. A child would sleep with a rabbit, seated as if on watch. Naomi breathed in and out, measured and even, the way she had in the church, and the diner, and the warehouse. The red door drifted backward in the mirror. The road came forward. She did not look back again. We are not running to hide, she said, quiet and certain. We are running to keep the truth moving. Spring did not arrive so much as collect itself and step over the threshold. The last rims of snow receded into gutters, leaving seams of damp that smelled like iron and rain. The trust woke each morning the same way a careful boiler does, low and even, a hum through the vents that said someone had measured, someone had checked, someone had turned the wheel with a steady hand. Naomi unlocked the glass door, let the warmth roll forward, and counted what was needed before the first client spoke the first sentence. Shoes, paper, names. The plaque on the wall shone without asking for it. For those who believed truth is worth the fire. Patricia ran her ledger with a pencil that had been resharpened down to its small, honest core. Volunteers moved like a practiced crew, boots in rows by size, coats arranged by sleeve length, fruit in baskets that made color where the winter had left none. The schedule with delivery times and hash notes hung where the sun could find it, the way a farmer hangs a calendar not to dream, but to keep a field alive. Zoe arrived in her small boots with Pepper under one arm and a paper heart pinned to her jacket like a quiet badge. She went to the board that listed what they had and what they needed, and taped a new square of hope to the corner where space had been left open on purpose. Then she stood with arms folded and studied the room the way a child studies a map before she takes a step along it. "This corner needs company," she said, and then nodded as if the room had answered. The city kept moving around them, louder some days and quieter others, but it kept its distance when the glass door swung and the bell gave its short, good sound. A woman with a newborn came for help with heat, and Naomi walked her to the register and wrote the number of the account that would be paid, and wrote the initials of the clerk who had approved it, and set the time down in square letters that respected time for what it is. A teenage boy asked for a pair of 11s without knowing how to ask, and left with the right size and a second lace in his pocket, because Patricia's jaw had a kindness that liked to pretend it was only habit. Midweek brought a courier with a pale envelope that had the weight of a thing that would change nothing and yet settle everything. Dorothy had been told to come to the trust because the courthouse preferred a delivery with witnesses and warmth. She arrived with a scarf pulled tight and hands that wanted to make fists but held still. Mrs. Angela Rodriguez from Community Services stood at the desk with her paper pad and her specific pen, the one she used when words needed to land and stay landed. Rachel was present because a line had to be drawn where story becomes record, and then the pencil must lift and go silent. The courier signed. Patricia signed. Mrs. Rodriguez signed. Naomi printed the hour in her square, honest hand and slid the blotter so the ink would take without smearing. Then she opened the envelope and tipped a ring into her palm. It had been cleaned but not polished. As if someone had respected that metal learns its own weather, she set it in a small dish and filled the dish with the papers that named it and numbered it and noted its path through a chain of people who had chosen not to lie. Dorothy watched without blinking. Her mouth did not tremble. Her eyes did not chase any person in the room. When Naomi lifted the dish and held it level at the counter edge, Dorothy placed both hands on either side the way a person holds a book they have missed. It seated itself the way a truth returns to the page where it belongs. There was no speech. There was a line for receipt and a line for acknowledgement. And Naomi turned the form, and Dorothy wrote her name. And in that slow, small motion, a year of air left the room, and the room filled back with something it could keep. "Thank you," Dorothy said, "not to a person, to the work." Mrs. Rodriguez cleared her throat and turned another page. "The other matter," she said, "dry as law and twice as clean." She gestured out the glass. Across the street, a man in a municipal vest was stacking bags of sand along a low wall where the melt would flood if no one told it not to. Richard Sterling moved like a person learning a language with his hands. He did not look toward the trust. He did not raise his voice. Under the eye of Mrs. Rodriguez he lifted, carried, placed, and stepped back to check his own straight line. He learned the schedule of the truck and the weight of the bags, and what it means to take instruction from a woman who does not explain twice. Dorothy watched him for a moment through the glass. She made no speech, and Naomi was glad, because speeches spend what a day needs to save. Mrs. Rodriguez signed the page that confirmed hours served and tasks completed, and added no adjectives. "Work is a sentence," she said softly, "not a paragraph." Sterling kept moving his hands. The day widened and did not break. A school counselor called to ask about a quiet kid with a hunger that was not only about lunch, and Naomi listened to the voice and made 3 small notes and said, "Bring him after last period, and we will make a place where his shoulders can sit down." A donor stopped by with 2 bags of socks and a need to tell a story, and Patricia took the socks and heard the story, but did not let it grow beyond its proper size on the page. In the late light, Rachel returned without a camera and stood with her back to the window, so the glow made a simple halo of her hair. She did not ask to record. She did not ask to quote. She looked at the counters, the clocks, the lists, and said only this. The charges reached the stage with the flags. The men who wore suits like armor learned the difference between a door and a wall. The office with the slow clock is on time now. Naomi did not smile. She wrote the hour in her ledger, and the word "received" beside it. Then she folded the ledger closed and set her palm on its cover, the way a person sets a lid on a pot that has finally come to a quiet boil. "We are the keepers," she said, "keepers of heat, keepers of lists, keepers of a promise that was written before the fire and carried through it." Zoe stood on the stool behind the desk and raised Pepper as if he were a small, dignified witness. "We are the keepers," she said, with the gravity of an oath. Her voice did not need to be loud. The vent hummed. The bell at the door breathed once, as though agreeing. Night began to build its long blue hallway outside. Naomi made one last round with the set of keys that had become an old friend. She turned a thermostat down and a light off and a light on where a corner did not like the dark. At the coat rack she wrote a note that said, "Please take only what fits," and taped it at a child's eye level. At the shelving she printed an order for salt and left it on Patricia's ledger where it could not be ignored. She checked the latch on the back door and pressed the metal with the heel of her hand until it answered with the right resistance. Before she turned the front sign, Naomi paused at the plaque and touched the cool brass with 2 fingers. Under her shirt, the little drive rested warm against her skin, the way a coal rests under ash, a thing that carries its own small star. Warmth holds charge, cold steals. She had said it in winter as a rule of work. In spring, it had become a way to live. Zoe came to stand beside her and leaned her head against Naomi's sleeve. "Are we done for today?" she asked. "For today," Naomi said. "Tomorrow, we do it again." That is how keeping works. She turned the sign from open to closed. The word looked right because it meant rest and not retreat. Through the glass, the lobby held its soft order. The board of hashes and deliveries reflected the last of the daylight, like a quiet instrument hung up after a tune is finished but not forgotten. The windows kept their warm squares steady over the damp street, as if the building were breathing out a promise it intended to keep. They stepped into the evening. The air carried the smell of wet wood and early soil. Across the way, Sterling lifted another sandbag, set it with the others, and stood back to check for level. Mrs. Rodriguez watched without blinking. A teacher at a blackboard no one would dare touch. Dorothy turned her ring, felt its seat. and went down the steps with her shoulders no longer listing to one side. Naomi locked the door and checked it once more with the small push. An electrician trusts more than a look. Zoe hopped over a shallow puddle and landed sure. Pepper rode tucked, a soft map folded in a small arm. They walked toward the truck in a rhythm that had the shape of ordinary days, a beat for boots, and a lighter beat for small boots that plan to grow. At the curb, Naomi glanced back one last time without making it a ceremony. The windows held, the heat held, the lists held, the promise held. She breathed that picture into a place where memory does not smudge. Just as signs in cold ink, every story leaves behind a small ember, something that stays lit long after the noise fades. USB versus Empire is not just about corruption, but about the quiet courage it takes to face systems built to silence us. It reminds us that truth rarely shouts. It waits in the patient hands of those who document, who speak when it's costly, who refuse to confuse peace with quiet. Naomi's fight wasn't loud, but it was precise. Every receipt, every signature, every moment she chose integrity over convenience became an act of defiance. For many of us, injustice doesn't always come with flashing lights. It hides in subtle dismissals, in relationships that shrink our worth, in the voices that tell us to stay small. Yet, as the old saying goes, gold fears no fire. When tested, our values, like gold, reveal their true strength. The story urges us to keep our own receipts, not of transactions, but of courage. Moments we told the truth, demanded fairness, or stood up for someone who couldn't. Justice, after all, isn't an institution. It's a habit. It's the daily act of showing up with compassion, of keeping warmth alive in a cold world. If this story spoke to you, share what part stayed with you in the comments. Have you ever faced a moment when silence felt safer, but you chose to speak instead? Leave your thoughts below. Hit like if the story moved you, and subscribe for more tales that challenge and heal at once. May you find quiet strength in your own fight, light in the small acts of honesty, and peace that doesn't come from avoiding the storm, but from standing tall within it.